And then you also have talked about, when you were asked about risk of response, which I thought was quite interesting, because if you have to respond to climate, global warming, but there are risks in how you do so, because if you suddenly cut off coal and gas and oil prices collapse, states that rely on fossil fuels suddenly become very unstable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you need to think through, right, the energy transition and what some of those risks are there. I think the good news is we can use predictive capabilities and pre-planning to get ahead of some of those risks, right? But they're important to think about, and even in countries that don't rely on fossil fuels, but maybe raising gas prices can be a real challenge, like we saw in France with the Yellow Vest movement a few years ago, right? There's a potential for internal turmoil and instability. I also think there are risks around geoengineering, for example, and that is a response. And if countries or individuals take unilateral action, obviously the international system for managing geoengineering or setting up rules of the road really lags where the science is. And so I think that's an area of concern as well, and it would be good for the international community to get ahead of that. That was actually in one of the documents released by the Biden administration last week was a national intelligence estimate from the intelligence community on the risks of climate change, and geoengineering was a key piece in that document.
Yeah, and if people don't think that conflict is sparked by something, I wouldn't call it small, but often we think of political uprisings because of, they don't like the change of government power or
Mm-hmm.
corruption. Often all of that exists as the backdrop, but they are sparked by simple things like a bad harvest and somebody raises the price of bread by a few cents, and that can take people to the street, same as the lack of water supply.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think it's so important to think about this as systemic risk, right? That it's instead of getting caught up in debates about what percentage of the conflict was caused by climate change, for example, you'll sometimes see academics go down that road. I think it's more important to understand how, again, that shaping environment, what is climate doing to the environment in which these actors are operating? How are actors responding? I think you can look at Ethiopia right now as a good example of that, and been in conflict since November of 2020. The proximate cause there was not a climate related issue. It's obviously political. But when you look at what climate has done to that country over the past 20 years, changing rainfall, higher temperatures, destroying agriculture, obviously the environment is it lacks resilience. And then when you think about peace building and managing that, if you don't, again, bring that climate lens, you're not going to get the right answers going forward.
So you make the point that the climate lens becomes the factor in
Mm-hmm.
terms of future disruption. Why is the US intelligence community so hesitant, reticent to get involved in climate?
I think there's a few different challenges. Some of them are structural, right? Our national security institutions in the US were set up at a time when states were the primary threat, and that's how we focus on things. And so this idea of actorless threats, right, is challenging to wrap folks' minds around. I think there has been concern in the intelligence community previously about the polarization on the issue and the politicization, and instead of taking a stand, they just say nope, not our job, we don't do it. And I also think it doesn't tend to have scientific backgrounds or data rich backgrounds, and so their ability to bring that climate understanding to the conversation is hard. I think that's changing now, and I think the Biden administration has put a priority on changing that, but it takes time. And I think one of the challenges has been with his ambitious climate, foreign policy and security plans, is the bench in the federal government has been relatively thin of a climate strong national security workforce. But again, I think that's changing, and that's some work we're doing to try and change that, because I think you have to bridge that gap between the scientists and the national security community and make sure they're communicating and working together on this critical issue.
I'm from Canada, so I like your analogy to a thin bench. Hopefully you're referring to hockey. You also talk about, in addition to risks, there are opportunities, right?
Mm.
Because if the US is able to predict some of the unrest, predicts some of the climate challenges that countries will face. It's also able to intervene and help those countries and help those allies rather than lose them as allies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, when you look at polling of nations in Southeast Asia, right, and they're asked to, the public is asked to rank the threats they're most concerned about, climate change rises to the top in almost every country, about 10 points ahead of the risk of conflict with other states. And so the United States has a lot of tools we can bring to help those countries manage climate risks and climate security risks. And it can be closer partnerships with militaries on making bases and facilities more resilient. It can be helping with humanitarian assistance and disaster relief missions, which are only going to, the demand for those is going to increase due to climate change. It can be helping with energy technologies. All of these things that the U.S. can bring to the table that those countries really need, I think then can help make sure that they're there with us when other challenges arise, right? If they're too consumed by managing climate risks internally, they're not going to be there when we need them. And so I think that's really important and something we bring to the table.
As the climate becomes more fragile, it's ripe for exploitation, and there are issues raised in by your organization and others about environmental terrorism. Can you just walk me through that?
Sure, I think,
and it's by non-state actors, some of it.
Yeah, I mean, one area of concern is that violent extremist groups can take advantage of the strain on governments due to climate for recruitment, right, and for taking action. I think there's also concerns that U.S. adversaries and could be state actors are trying to take advantage in places like the Arctic and elsewhere and operate in the gray zone, if you will, to take action and push. I think also to push misinformation to further the political divide in the United States on these issues.
Sounds like you just talked about Russia on two different points there.
Yes, I did. And so I think that's all an area of concern. I think also competing over access to rare earth minerals, right? That things you need for the energy transition as well as another potential flashpoint. So all of these pieces together, but you've seen, especially with violent extremist groups, when water issues or food issues come up in countries, you see this in Somalia with Al-Shabaab, where they try to take advantage and use it to their advantage and try to control territory.
So if we can kind of come back to COP26, are you deeply concerned, like so many others, that they really, I mean, probably are not doomed to fail, but probably fall short of where they need to be, and that further feeds, international security concerns everywhere?
I think if they don't raise ambitions high enough and take strong enough action, absolutely the international security landscape is affected. I am generally a hopeful person, and I have seen some progress from some countries that makes me hopeful, but they got to get it done, right? There's no time to waste, and I think beyond even just cutting emissions, it's also making sure they're helping the countries that are going to face the brunt of these effects sooner rather than later, and climate finance has to be a key piece of it.
Right on the tail, not on the tail because we're still in a pandemic, but right in the middle of, everybody struggling economically in a pandemic as well. I mean, it's a perfect storm.
Right. And we need to do that on the climate finance, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it has security implications if we don't. Right. And for all the reasons we just talked about, if these governments can't manage these challenges, they don't have help in building better resilience, it's going to affect all of us and affect all of us negatively.
But it is already politicized to the point that you don't have China coming and Russia coming. And if you don't have the big players at the table, where does that leave the discussion?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge. I think the thing I am going to focus on is what those countries actually commit to doing, whether they're at COP or not, and I think that's the big focus. But I think the pressure is building on the security front in a way that I frankly would have been surprised to see just a few years ago. The Russian national security strategy that was released this summer mentioned climate change 9 times. And so I think in those countries as well, there is a push from the security community to say, look, this represents a risk to us. I don't know if that's going to be enough to push them fast enough and far enough, but I think it is helping. I hope.
Erin Sikorsky, the Center for Climate and Security. Erin, you have a huge background in security issues and climate, and it really is a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you. I mean, the time with you is golden, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.